They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but let me tell you something, success tastes even better when it's served on a silver platter while the people who betrayed you are drowning in their own mistakes. And my name is Caroline Mitchell, and at 67 years old, my husband of 42 years walked out of our home, our marriage, and our life together. His destination, the bed of the woman I had called my best friend for nearly 3 decades, and 6 months later I watched through tears as they exchanged vows at a courthouse wedding I learned about through Facebook. But here's what they didn't see coming. Here's what nobody saw coming, including me, because today, 5 years later, I'm sitting in my lakefront home, not the cramped 2-bedroom ranch David and I shared, but a custom-built contemporary with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. My business partner is Pamela's ex-husband Richard. Our company is worth $8.3 million and growing, and David and Pamela, well, they're discovering that building a marriage on betrayal creates a foundation about as stable as quicksand. And this is my story. And if you're going through something similar, or if you've ever felt like your life was over when someone walked away, I need you to hear every word, because what happened to me could happen to you in the best possible way. So let me take you back to where this all began. September 2019, when I had just turned 67 and David was 68, and we'd been married since I was 25 years old. A lifetime together, raising 3 children in our modest home in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I worked as a school secretary for 30 years before retiring at 62, and David worked as an accountant at a local manufacturing firm. And we weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, or at least I thought we were. And Pamela Jennings had been my best friend since 1992, since the day we met at a PTA meeting when our daughters were in 3rd grade together. Pamela vibrant and funny, and always dressed like she'd stepped out of a Talbot's catalog. Her husband Richard running a small commercial printing business, making business cards, brochures, and promotional materials. Pamela herself a real estate agent, though semi-retired by the time all of this happened. And the 4 of us, David, Pamela, Richard, and one, were inseparable, with Friday night dinners, vacation trips to Door County, Wisconsin, holiday parties, our kids growing up together, anniversaries celebrated together, standing by one another through Richard's father's death, through my mother's battle with breast cancer, through David's knee replacement surgery. And I trusted these people with my life, which is what makes betrayal so devastating, because it's not just the act itself, it's the shattering of everything you believe to be true. And the first crack in my reality came on a Tuesday evening in September, when David said he was going to Home Depot to pick up some supplies for a shelf he was building in the garage. Nothing unusual, since he'd been doing little projects around the house since retirement, but something made me glance at his iPad on the kitchen counter before he left, still open to his messages. And I wasn't snooping, I want to be clear about that. The screen was lit up and I saw a notification from P that said, "Can't wait to see you tonight, my love, and my hands went cold, my heart hammering so hard in my chest I thought I might pass out. And I told myself it was nothing, maybe spam, maybe a wrong number, but I knew David's contacts, and P was Pamela, a name I'd seen 100 times when she texted him about dinner plans or coordinated our get-togethers. And when David came back into the kitchen because he'd forgotten his wallet and saw me standing there with his iPad in my hands, the color drained from his face, and he said, "Caroline, I can explain." Those 4 words every betrayed spouse has heard, always followed by explanations that explain nothing and excuse everything. And he confessed right there in our kitchen by the refrigerator, where our grandchildren's drawings were held up with magnets, admitting he'd been having an affair with Pamela for 8 months, claiming it started innocently enough because Pamela was having problems with Richard and needed someone to talk to, and David was there. And one thing led to another. One thing led to another. As if a decades-long friendship and a 42-year marriage could dissolve because of happenstance. As if vows and loyalty were just suggestions that could be abandoned so easily. And when I asked if Richard knew, he said no. When I asked if he loved her, he hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the truth, that he did, or at least thought he did. And when I asked if he wanted a divorce, he said yes, just like that, yes, with no fight for our marriage, no counseling, no attempt to repair what he'd broken, just yes. And 3 days later he moved out, packing his clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of old vinyl records, leaving 42 years reduced to boxes in the back of a U-Haul truck. And the next 2 weeks were the darkest of my life, as I barely ate, couldn't sleep, and woke up at 3 a.m., reaching for him, forgetting for just a moment that he was gone. And then reality would crash over me like a wave, and I'd lie there in the dark wondering what I'd done wrong. wondering if I'd been boring, if I'd let myself go, if I'd been a bad wife, and my daughter Jennifer came to stay with me, furious with her father, though I could see the pain in her eyes too, because her family was breaking apart and her father had done something unthinkable. And one morning over coffee she said, "Mom, you need to tell Richard," and I told her I'd thought about it. God, had I thought about it. But the idea of making that phone call, of telling a man I'd known for nearly 30 years that his wife was sleeping with my husband, felt impossible. How do you even find those words? But Jennifer was right and Richard deserved to know. So I called him on a Sunday afternoon and he answered cheerfully, asking if Pamela and I wanted to come over for dinner that week like we usually did. And I said, "Richard," my voice shaking, "I need to tell you something, and it's going to hurt. David and Pamela are having an affair." And the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. And when I asked if he was there, he finally said, "How long?" his voice hollow. And I told him David said 8 months, and that I'd just found out 2 weeks ago. And he repeated 8 months like he was trying to make sense of a foreign language, saying 8 months, and he had no idea, that he had absolutely no idea. And we talked for an hour, while he told me Pamela had been distant lately, but he'd attributed it to work stress, to her taking more evening appointments with clients, to her joining a gym and being gone for hours at a time, all the cliches of an affair that he'd missed every single one of. And he confronted her that night and she didn't deny it. And from what he told me later, she'd actually seemed relieved to have it out in the open, because she wanted a divorce too. She was in love with David and they were going to build a life together. And I felt sick, not just for myself but for Richard, because it was 2 marriages destroyed, 2 families fractured. And for what? For some fantasy of new love in their late 60s, and the divorce proceedings were brutal in their efficiency, because David wanted it done quickly, and I didn't fight him, since you can't force someone to love you, and you can't chain someone to a marriage they're desperate to leave. So we divided our assets. The house went to me because he didn't want it anyway, said it held too many memories. Our retirement accounts were split, 42 years neatly divided into columns on a spreadsheet, and Richard's divorce was equally swift because Pamela was eager to move forward with her new life. And 6 months after David walked out of our kitchen with his confession, he and Pamela got married in a small courthouse ceremony, which I found out about when my friend Linda sent me a screenshot from Facebook showing a photo Pamela had posted of them signing the marriage license, both of them grinning like teenagers with a caption that read, "Beginning our new adventure together," followed by a string of heart emojis. And I stared at that photo for a long time because David looked happy, genuinely happy, and that's what hurt most. Not that he'd left, but that he seemed so much better off without me, and I cried for 3 days straight. And it was during that dark period that Richard showed up at my door, with a bottle of wine, and a proposition. And I almost didn't answer because I was in sweatpants and an old t-shirt with unwashed hair and tissues scattered around the living room. But when I looked through the peephole and saw Richard standing there with the same devastated exhaustion I saw in my own mirror, I opened the door, and he said simply, "I couldn't be alone tonight. I thought maybe you couldn't either." And we sat in my living room and drank that bottle of wine, and then opened another one from my cabinet and talked about everything: the betrayal, the humiliation, the way people looked at us with pity at the grocery store, the way mutual friends didn't know what to say and sometimes crossed the street to avoid the awkward conversation. And Richard kept refilling his glass and saying he wondered what he did wrong, that he gave her everything, built a good life, was faithful, loved her, and it wasn't enough. And I told him I knew exactly what he meant because I'd replayed 42 years in my head, looking for the moment I failed, wondering when I stopped being enough. And he looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I didn't fail, that they failed, that they were the ones who broke their vows and betrayed trust and blew up everything for what? Some midlife crisis, some fantasy that new love would be better than built love." And I repeated built love, saying I liked that phrase because my grandmother used to say, "Love isn't just a feeling but a house you build together brick by brick, year by year." And what Pamela and David had wasn't built love, just infatuation with a new coat of paint. And we talked until 2 in the morning, and somewhere in that conversation something shifted. The weight I'd been carrying felt a little lighter, because I wasn't alone, because someone understood. Someone was in the same boat, rowing through the same storm. And Richard started coming over once a week and we'd have dinner, watch old movies, and talk about our kids and our lives. It wasn't romantic. Neither of us were ready for that, and maybe we never would be. But it was companionship. It was understanding. It was healing. And 3 months into our friendship, Richard mentioned that his printing business was struggling because digital marketing had taken over and fewer businesses needed traditional printed materials, and he was thinking about selling it or just closing up shop. And I asked him, what if you didn't close it? And he asked, what if you pivoted to what? And I told him I'd been doing research online, partly to distract myself from my depression, and partly because I needed something to do with my days, and that I'd stumbled across articles about the growing market for personalized memory books, custom photo albums, and legacy printing services. And I said, seniors, people our age, we have a lifetime of photos, but they're either rotting in boxes or trapped in hard drives. So what if we helped people create beautiful, professionally printed memory books, family histories, legacy albums, something they can pass down to their grandchildren? And Richard leaned forward, interested, and said, keep talking. And I told him to think about it, that our generation isn't as tech-savvy as our kids, but we have the stories and the photos, and we want to preserve them, but we don't know how. And we could offer a full-service experience where people send us their photos and stories, and we design beautiful books and print them on high-quality archival paper with professional binding, something that will last for generations. And Richard said slowly that it was actually brilliant, that he already had all the printing equipment and just needed to upgrade a few things for higher quality photo printing. But he asked if I knew anything about design or running a business. And I admitted no, but said I could learn, and that I'd been a school secretary for 30 years and knew how to organize, manage schedules, and deal with people. And I could handle the business side while he handled the printing side. And Richard was quiet for a moment before saying we'd be partners, equal partners, 50-50, and he extended his hand and said, let's do it. And we shook on it right there in my living room, and looking back it was probably crazy. Two heartbroken people in their late 60s starting a business together with no real plan and no business experience between us. But sometimes crazy is exactly what you need. And we named the company Legacy Memories. And Richard took out a loan against his printing business to upgrade equipment and rent a small office space. And I invested $15,000 from my divorce settlement, which was a risk because at my age I couldn't afford to lose that money. But something inside me had awakened, a determination I didn't know I possessed, because I was tired of being the victim, tired of crying, tired of feeling like my life was over. And I was 68 years old and starting over, and damn it, I was going to succeed. And the first 3 months were brutal as we created a website even though neither of us knew what we were doing, designed sample books, and reached out to senior centers, retirement communities, and local libraries to offer free workshops on preserving family memories. And our first client was a 73-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose husband had recently passed away, and who had boxes and boxes of photos of their wedding, their 5 children growing up, vacations, holidays, and birthdays. And she wanted to create a memory book for each of her kids. So I spent hours with Dorothy, going through those photos and listening to her stories, because each picture had a tale. This was taken the day Tommy got his driver's license. This was from their 25th anniversary trip to Hawaii. This was little Sarah's first day of kindergarten, and I helped her organize them chronologically, write captions, and choose meaningful quotes. And when Richard delivered the finished books 2 weeks later, Dorothy cried and held those books like they were treasures, because they were, because we'd taken her memories and made them tangible, permanent, and beautiful. And she told us thank you and said it was the most precious gift she'd ever given her children. And that was when I knew we had something special. And word spread quickly as Dorothy told her friends, and her friends told their friends. And we started getting calls from people all over Michigan, and then from neighboring states. And our little operation grew beyond what we'd imagined. And I learned graphic design through online tutorials, staying up until midnight practicing layouts and photo editing, while Richard brought in a young designer named Marcus who taught us about color theory and modern design aesthetics. And we hired 2 part-time employees to help with customer service and photo scanning. But the real magic wasn't in the technical side, it was in the stories. Because every client brought us their lives in boxes and envelopes and thumb drives, and I got to know each one, spending hours on the phone asking questions and drawing out details like, when did you meet your husband? What was your mother like? Tell me about the house you grew up in. And I wasn't just creating books, I was preserving legacies and honoring lives lived. And in doing so, I was healing my own wounds, because each story reminded me that life was bigger than my pain, that love and loss and joy and heartbreak were universal human experiences, that I wasn't alone in my suffering, and I wouldn't be alone in my recovery. And by the end of the first year, Legacy Memories had generated $180,000 in revenue, and we were profitable. Not rich, but successful. And more importantly, we'd found purpose, because Richard and I made a good team, with him handling production and the technical side, while I managed client relationships and business operations. And we complemented each other's strengths and covered each other's weaknesses. And slowly, without either of us quite realizing it was happening, we became more than business partners, becoming friends, real friends built on respect and shared experience and genuine care for each other. And in year 2, we expanded our services as we started offering video digitization, helping people convert old VHS tapes and film reels into digital formats, created a line of memorial books for funeral homes, developed partnerships with genealogy services to help people create comprehensive family history books, and also started hosting memory preservation workshops at community centers and libraries, where I'd stand in front of rooms full of seniors and teach them how to organize their photos, how to interview family members for stories, how to preserve fragile documents, workshops that became incredibly popular not just because people wanted to preserve their memories, but because they craved connection and community. As many of the people who attended were like me, divorced, widowed, or alone, and they'd show up with their boxes of photos and leave with friends and plans to meet for coffee. Until our business became more than a service and turned into a gathering place for people rediscovering themselves in later life, and Richard and I moved into a larger facility, hired 6 full-time employees and a dozen part-timers, invested in state-of-the-art printing equipment, launched a sophisticated website with online ordering capabilities, and by the end of year 2, our revenue hit $650,000. We were featured in a Grand Rapids magazine article about successful local businesses, and people started recognizing me at the grocery store, not as the woman whose husband left her, but as the founder of Legacy Memories, a shift in identity that was profound because I was no longer defined by what had been done to me but by what I was building. And running a successful business changed me in ways I never expected as I became more confident, more assertive, learned to trust my instincts and make tough decisions, had to negotiate contracts, manage employees, deal with difficult clients, none of which came naturally to me after spending my career as a school secretary supporting others rather than leading. Yet I discovered I was good at leadership, good at seeing the big picture while managing details, good at making people feel heard and valued. Realizing all those years of supporting teachers and students and administrators had taught me skills I didn't know I possessed. While my relationship with Richard evolved as we weren't just business partners but genuinely close friends who celebrated each other's successes, supported each other through challenges, and understood each other's pain in ways no one else could. And although people occasionally asked if we were dating, we weren't, and neither of us were interested in romantic relationships because we'd both been so deeply wounded that opening our hearts again felt impossible. Yet we had something deeper than romance: partnership, trust, and mutual respect forged in fire. While my children were amazed by my transformation, as Jennifer told me she was proud of me, my son Michael, who'd been distant during the divorce, started calling more often, and my youngest Amy brought her kids by the office to see what Grandma was building. And when Jennifer said to me one evening over dinner, "Mom, you seem happier than I've seen you in years," even before Dad left, she was right, because I was happy, not despite what happened but somehow because of it, as the betrayal destroyed my old life but forced me to build a new one, and this new life was entirely mine. Though living in the same city as David and Pamela meant I occasionally ran into them, the first time being at a restaurant about 18 months after the wedding when I was there with Richard and Marcus, celebrating landing a big contract with a senior living community chain, seeing them across the room before they saw me, David and Pamela sitting in a corner booth, not smiling, David looking tired and older than I remembered, while Pamela talked animated, gesturing with her hands, and David stared at his plate with an expression I knew well, the look he got when he wanted to be anywhere but where he wasn't, till Pamela looked up and saw me, her face flushing as she leaned across the table and said something to David, who turned, saw me, and went pale. And though I could have looked away, or pretended I didn't see them, something in me had changed, because I wasn't the devastated crying woman anymore. I was Caroline Mitchell, successful business owner. So I held David's gaze for a moment and smiled, not a warm smile but not a hostile one either, just an acknowledgement. "I see you, I'm fine, I'm better than fine," before turning back to my dinner companions and continuing our celebration, prompting Richard to say quietly that took guts, and me to answer no, it took healing. As the encounters became more frequent over time in a mid-sized city where you couldn't avoid people forever, And I heard through mutual friends that David and Pamela's relationship wasn't the fairy tale they'd imagined, that the excitement of an affair didn't translate well into the reality of daily life together, that Pamela had expected David to be romantic and attentive the way he'd been during their affair, while David was just David, a creature of habit who liked his routines and quiet time. The man who once snuck around with her during stolen afternoon hours, now the same man who fell asleep in his recliner by 8 p.m., and David had expected Pamela to be exciting and spontaneous. But Pamela was high maintenance and demanding, constantly wanting to go places and do things and prove to everyone that their relationship was wonderful. And the fantasy woman he'd risked everything for turned out to be just another flawed human being, with annoying habits and insecurities. And I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, not exactly, but I won't lie. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that what they'd destroyed my life for wasn't the paradise they'd imagined. And year 3 was when everything exploded in the best possible way, because we were approached by a national senior living corporation that owned facilities across 15 states and wanted to offer legacy memory services to all their residents, over 50,000 seniors, with a contract worth $2.44 million over 3 years. And Richard and I sat in my office after the signing, just staring at each other in disbelief as he said, "We did it." And I whispered, "We actually did it." Because that contract changed everything, and we had to scale up dramatically, moving into a 10,000 square foot facility, hiring a full staff, including a crew to help manage operations, investing in commercial-grade equipment, and developing a training program so we could replicate our services across multiple locations. And my salary went from modest to substantial as Richard and I were each drawing 6-figure incomes. And at 71 years old, I was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible. But more than the money, it was the impact, because we were now preserving memories for thousands of people, employing 40 people, most of them in our community, and we'd created something meaningful. And I bought my lake house that year, the custom contemporary I mentioned at the start, which was everything my old house wasn't: modern, spacious, filled with light, and I furnished it exactly how I wanted without compromise or consideration for anyone else's taste. Every room mine. And I also started traveling as Richard, and I took a trip to Italy not as a couple but as friends, celebrating our success, eating pasta in Rome, touring vineyards in Tuscany, and laughing until our sides hurt, because life had become full again, rich and meaningful, until year 4 brought unexpected drama when I heard through the grapevine that David and Pamela were having serious financial troubles, since Pamela had quit her real estate job to focus on the marriage, and they were living on just David's pension and Social Security, had taken out a reverse mortgage on the house Pamela got in her divorce from Richard, and were now struggling with those payments. While meanwhile Richard and I had been featured in several business publications, and our success was public knowledge, impossible to miss if you lived in Grand Rapids. And I knew it must be eating at David that his former wife was now a millionaire businesswoman, the woman he'd left because she was boring and stuck in routine, having completely transformed her life while he was stuck with the reality of the choice he'd made. And then one day David called me after more than 3 years of silence, saying uncertainly, "Caroline, I know you probably don't want to hear from me." And I asked, "What do you want, David?" As he said he'd heard about my business and how successful I'd become, and that he was really happy for me. And I waited because there was always more. And he admitted things had been tough financially for Pam and him, and wondered if maybe Legacy Memories might need a part-time accountant, and he could help with the books. And I said firmly, no. And when he pleaded and said we'd spent 42 years together, and that had to count for something, and that he was struggling while I was doing so well, I asked, "You thought what, David, that I owe you something, that I should give you a job after what you did?" And when he said he thought I might be willing to help an old friend, I laughed, actually laughed, and told him, "We're not friends, David. We're not anything. You made your choice. You left me for Pamela. You built your new life. Now live it. Don't call me again." And I hung up with my hands shaking but feeling powerful, because I'd stood up for myself and refused to be the understanding, accommodating Caroline who put everyone else's needs first. And Richard hugged me when I told him, and said he was proud of me. And by year 5, Legacy Memories was valued at $8.3 million, with several companies interested in buying us out. A possibility Richard and I discussed seriously, because we could have sold and walked away with millions and retired in comfort. But we realized we didn't want to, because the business wasn't just about money. It was about purpose, about the clients who cried when they received their books, the employees who said it was the best job they'd ever had, and the community we'd built. So we decided to keep growing instead. And now, at 72 with Richard at 73 ages, when we were supposed to be winding down and preparing for our final years, we were building, expanding, and planning for the future, leaving my children amazed at the transformation, until Amy said during a family dinner, "Mom, you're like a completely different person," and I corrected her by saying, "No, I'm more myself than I've ever been. I just didn't know this version of me existed." And that was the truth of it. The old Carolyn David's wife, the accommodating school secretary, the woman who made everyone else comfortable, she was real, but she was also incomplete, and it took losing everything to discover the parts of myself I'd never accessed, the courage, the vision, the leadership, the strength. And today, as I sit in my lake house watching the sun set over the water, I think about the journey, because 5 years ago I was devastated and broken and genuinely thought my life was over, discarded after 42 years of marriage, and replaced with someone I'd trusted completely. Yet that ending was actually a beginning. And now, Richard and I run a multi-million-dollar company. We employ 67 people. We've preserved memories for over 15,000 families. We've been featured in national business magazines. We've spoken at entrepreneurship conferences about starting businesses later in life. And as for David and Pamela, I heard they separated last year. The marriage that destroyed 2 families lasting barely 4 years. Pamela moving back to her old house, the one with the reverse mortgage she can barely afford. David living in a small apartment downtown, both of them alone now in their 70s, living with the consequences of their choices. And I don't take pleasure in their pain, but I won't pretend I don't notice the irony, because they gave up built love for infatuation, and discovered that infatuation has a very short shelf life, while meanwhile Richard and I have built something that will outlast us, creating a legacy of our own, not through romance or passion, but through partnership, respect, and shared purpose. And if you're watching this and you've been betrayed, if you've been left, if you've been discarded, I want you to hear this. Your life is not over. Your story is not finished. What happened to you is not your fault. You did not fail. They failed. They broke their vows. They betrayed trust. That's on them, not you. But what you do next, that's on you. Because you can choose to remain in the victim role, to let bitterness consume you, to let the betrayal define the rest of your life, or you can choose to transform your pain into purpose. And I didn't plan to become a millionaire businesswoman. I didn't plan to start over at 68. I didn't plan any of this. But when I was forced to rebuild, I chose to rebuild bigger and better than before. And was it easy, God? No, there were days I wanted to give up. The days I cried in my car before going into the office. Days I was certain I'd made a terrible mistake and should just accept that my best years were behind me. But I kept going, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one small success at a time. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, I became someone new, someone stronger, someone I'm proud to be. And you have gifts you haven't discovered yet, strengths you haven't accessed, possibilities you haven't imagined. But you'll never find them if you stay stuck in the story of what was done to you. So write a new story, one where you're not the victim but the hero, one where the ending hasn't been written yet because you're still creating it. Because I'm 72 years old and I'm just getting started, and if I can do this, so can you. And the betrayal that nearly destroyed me ended up being the catalyst for the best chapter of my life. Not because I got revenge, although, let's be honest, success is pretty sweet, but because it forced me to discover who I could be when I stopped being who I thought I had to be. Because David left me for my best friend. They got married 6 months later, and I started a business with her ex-husband, and now we're millionaires. But the real victory isn't the money. It's not the lake house or the successful company, or even the satisfaction of knowing they struggled while I thrived. The real victory is that I found myself, the version of me that was always there, buried under years of compromise and accommodation, and playing small to make others comfortable. And she was there all along waiting for her chance. And when that chance came, disguised as the worst thing that ever happened to me, she rose up and built a life worth living. And that's my story. That's my victory. And if you're going through something similar, I promise you, your story isn't over either. Because your best chapter might be waiting on the other side of your worst heartbreak. Mine was.